and I'm Associate Director of Public History at the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin. For those who were unable to join us for the previous events, I'm very pleased to remind you that Leo Baeck Institute is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebrations, we have launched a special series of 7 lectures, each exploring one key theme in German Jewish history through the lens of evolving historiography. So, a base for this series of lectures was the idea that historiography, like historiography itself, changes with each generation of scholars. After many decades in which German Jewish history was primarily framed around major political events and the lives of political leaders, historians have increasingly turned to microhistory, examining the experience of everyday people, including women, children, and marginalized communities. These newer approaches often focus on struggles, failures, and the broader social fabric that shaped Jewish life. Through this lecture series, the LBI seeks to present a wide-ranging view of 7 major topics in German Jewish history, asking how the way we write and understand the history has transformed over time. And today, we are honored to welcome Professor Leora Batnitzky, who will speak on religion. Leora Batnitzky is Perelman Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Religion at Princeton University. Her teaching and research interests include philosophy of religion, modern Jewish thought, hermeneutics, and contemporary legal and political theory. She's the author of Idolatry and Representation, The Philosophy of Franz Rosenzweig Reconsidered, Leo Strauss and Emmanuel Levinas, Philosophy and the Politics of Revelation, and How Judaism became a Religion, an introduction to modern Jewish thought. She's currently completing a book on Ecclesiastes, a biography, forthcoming in Princeton University Press, Lives of Great Religious Books series. She's also working on 2 other books. The first, a comparative study of conversion controversies in Israel and India, tentatively titled What is Religious Freedom? The Case of Conversion in Israel and India. And the second, on the Jewish apostate and Catholic saint Edith Stein, tentatively titled The Continued Relevance of Edith Stein for Jewish and Christian Self-Understanding. And before we will go to the presentation, I would like to remind you about the format of the event. So this is 1-hour event. Professor Batnitzky will talk for about 45 minutes and present her PowerPoint, which you already can see. And after that, we will have time for some questions. So please, if you have any question, please write it in the Q&A box, which is on the top of the Zoom screen. And now, Professor Batnitzky, the Zoom, the floor, and microphone are yours.
Okay, thanks very much. It's great to be here today, and I'm happy to wish the Leo Baeck Institute a happy 70th anniversary. I'm going to talk about the topic or concept of religion today, and I'm going to talk more specifically about how the study of Judaism relates to the study of religion and some of the debates that have changed in the study of religion, and how, once I think actually German Jewry and the study of German Jewry was in a lot of ways ahead of the game on some of these issues. So I'll say more. So let's begin with the question, which is a question that is a very still very much in the air today. Is Judaism a religion? I want to suggest to begin with that this is both a methodological question and a matter of substance. It's a methodological question because it's a question of how to categorize Judaism in terms of the study of religion. If you say Judaism is a religion, then it automatically suggests that Judaism is a religion like other religions, specifically like Christianity or Islam, maybe even like Buddhism, if Buddhism is a religion, or Hinduism, if that's a religion too. So there's that question. But it's also a substantive matter because I think one could argue that the question that German Jews had to answer, beginning with Moses Mendelssohn, was this question of whether Judaism is a religion or not. And I'll have more to say about that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this question of whether Judaism is a religion really relates to a broad question about the study of religion, but it's also very much, I think, at the heart of German Jewish debates about German Jewish identity from Mendelssohn forward. Now, this is also a political issue. In the German Jewish context, the question of whether or not Judaism is or isn't a religion was at the heart of questions of German citizenship. Could Jews become citizens of a German state in theory? Hinged in a lot of ways on the question of whether Judaism could be or was a religion. I'll talk more about how many Christian thinkers denied that Judaism was a religion and what that means. But it also became an increasing issue in the 19th century as well, with the rise of modern nationalism. And the question really has to do with whether or not this category of religion is something apolitical by definition. So in the German Jewish context, the historical context, the question is, as it was put then, and we still hear some of these phrases today, are Jews going to be a state within a state? And part of the answer we'll see that many Jews gave, Jews from different ideological stripes, is that no, Judaism's a religion, so it's not a state within the state. Today, this is a very prominent question in debates about Zionism and also about anti-Semitism. Is Judaism a religion? If Jews are attacked, unfortunately, say in the United States, are they being attacked because of their religion, or are they being attacked because of their national identity? Obviously, these are very complicated topics. It's all just to say that the question of whether Judaism is a religion is as alive today as it was in Moses Mendelssohn's day. Okay, so let's talk just very briefly about some approaches to the study of religion. So one question in the development of the study of religion, which really began in the 19th century in Germany, is the question of whether religion is its own category. So what does that mean for religion to be its own category? If you think about a modern university and you think about departments, the question is, should there be a religion department? Just like there's a philosophy department, like there's an economics department, like there's a physics department. Is religion enough of a category of its own that it is a sphere of society that we can, or of human life that we can speak of that's separate from other spheres? This is a very complicated question for anybody who is familiar with Jewish life in general, because it doesn't fit with lots of forms, if not most forms of Jewish life. But we'll talk more about that. And then the question is there a particular methodological approach to the study of religion? Meaning, how would you study something called religion as distinct from something called philosophy, or as distinct even, say, from something called history? Should we understand religion in terms of belief, experience, or behavior? And I would add history there, among other possibilities. Now, this is a question that was very much alive in the German Jewish context. And so I want to talk a little bit about a figure named Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is probably the most important person to define the modern concept of religion. And we'll see how Schleiermacher is related to some debates about Jewish emancipation in Germany in just a moment. So no single thinker did more to define the modern concept of religion than Schleiermacher, and he is really the father of modern Protestant theology. Among his writings, he wrote many other things, but is a book that he published in 1799 called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultural Despisers. And the subtitle of the book tells you a lot about the book, because Schleiermacher is writing to people who think they aren't religious, they have no room for religion, and he wants to say, well, actually, all of you cultural despisers, who are these people? These are mainly people who are artists and interested in literature and other forms of what we might call humanistic study. He wants to say to them, no, actually, you think, you culture despisers of religion, you think you're not religious, but once you understand what religion really is, I'm going to show you that you really are religious. So basically what Schleiermacher argues there is that religion is a separate sphere of life, and it's a sphere of life that he characterizes in terms of what he calls intuition and feeling. This means that religion is by definition separate from all other spheres of life, such as politics, philosophy, morality, and science. And religion, he says, is characterized by neither thinking nor acting, but by intuition and feeling. So what does that mean, that it's characterized by neither thinking nor acting, but by intuition and feeling? So part of what Schleiermacher was trying to do in this context was to say, well, there are ways in which we might if we might talk about, say, philosophy, and how is that characterized? It's characterized by thinking. That means you can bring all kinds of arguments and criticisms to the realm of philosophy. That's what philosophy is. Schleiermacher's trying to say, no, it's not that. So he's trying to protect this category of religion from philosophy, but it's also not acting. And he's trying here to protect religion from the category of politics. So he's self-consciously, again, trying to raise and make the point that, again, religion is its own category that deserves not just a study in and of itself, but it also deserves cultural respect. Okay. And so what is it? And here we'll see, he says, the essence of the religious emotions consist in the feeling of an absolute dependence. This is how he defines religion. So religion is a feeling. And again, it's a feeling that can't be criticized from the outside. So what does this mean? Once again, for Schleiermacher, it means holding a place for religion in modern society. But it also means an opportunity to say what's religion and what's not religion. And not surprisingly, Schleiermacher argues that Judaism is not even a religion. He says that this is how he describes Judaism. He says it's a, quote, dead religion, and those who at present still hear its colors are actually sitting and mourning beside the decaying mummy and weeping over its demise and its sad legacy, end quote. So that's not an uncommon kind of argument for a Protestant thinker to be making, that Judaism is at best a dead religion. Immanuel Kant, who wrote a little bit before Schleiermacher and to whom Schleiermacher is responding, also described Judaism as a historical artifact at best, nothing more. Now, how does this relate then to German Jewry? I want to suggest it relates to German Jewry in at least two important ways. From a kind of social and political historical perspective, it's important to note that 2 days after Schleiermacher sent off his manuscript on religion, or actually 2 days after it was published in 1799, he wrote a response to a controversy that was going on in Jewish circles. And that controversy had to do with a man named David Friedlander, whom some of you may have heard of. He was Moses Mendelssohn's disciple. Moses Mendelssohn had already died when this controversy came up. And Friedlander really wanted to make an argument that Jews could be full citizens of the German state. And the way that they would be full citizens was they would completely get rid of what Mendelssohn had called the Mosaic Law. And he also argued that Judaism was a religion, and therefore this would work. Now, what happened is that Friedlander wasn't met with any kind of success, and he made a proposal. He proposed that he would convert to Christianity, but on the condition that he didn't have to say that Jesus was God, that he didn't have to basically accept Jesus. And this caused a giant stir, and this is when Schleiermacher comes in. So Schleiermacher is very offended by this. He called Friedlander's proposal for conversion a blatant affront to Christianity, and he called it a disease. And here's a quote of, quote, Judaizing Christianity, end quote. So he had a great distaste, Schleiermacher, for Judaism, as we see, but he nevertheless was actually close friends with many Jews, and he actually recommended emancipation of the Jews, but he recommended on the condition that Jews would renounce in particular, their hopes for a messianic future, because a messianic future was seen as a claim that Jews are a nation and not just a religion. So Schleiermacher, interestingly enough, becomes a defender of Jewish emancipation, all while criticizing this idea that Judaism is a religion. So we already see here how this idea of religion is at the heart of German Jewish discussions of the about whether Jews could be emancipated, meaning whether they could get civil rights, political rights as individuals. Now, one of the things my understanding of the series is that maybe some of us are going to talk about how some of our perceptions, some of the scholars' perceptions have changed over time in terms of thinking about some of these categories. And my way of thinking about this question of is Judaism a religion really happened more in the context of teaching. And a long time ago at this point, almost probably more than 30 years ago, I was asked to give a guest lecture in a course by a colleague of mine. And the course was called Approaches to the Study of Religion. And it was a lower level undergraduate course. And my colleague, this was in this context, he was actually being quite generous by recognizing there were no Jewish thinkers in the course, and that we should have a Jewish thinker. And he suggested Moses Mendelssohn. So a lot of the way in which I came to think about what does it mean for Judaism to be a religion or not a religion from a kind of scholarly point of view had to do with having to teach some of this material, and particular having to teach Mendelssohn. And so what I want to suggest is that, as we discussed very briefly with Schleiermacher, the way in which religion had been treated both by Germans and German Jews living in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and also by scholars who were still very much, up until relatively recently, in the wake of Schleiermacher in terms of talking about how to study religion. Religion had been talked about as something that was fundamentally, by definition, apolitical, a category of its own that could be separated and not criticized in any other kinds of ways. And so part of where I began to recognize that religion is obviously not just something that's not political, but is precisely a political category, had to do with teaching Mendelssohn and thinking about how Mendelssohn really had to formulate this idea that Judaism was a religion for political reasons. I'll say more about that. But how he and almost all German Jews following him recognized that there was a real tension between describing Judaism as a religion and what Judaism or Jewishness had actually been, at least historically. So I'm going to talk a bit about Mendelssohn and then some of the people who came after Mendelssohn. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how different developments actually in the field of anthropology, not in the field of history, began to make some of the arguments about religion's political nature that I think German Jews were well aware of, and German Jewish scholars were well aware of quite some time ago. So let's talk briefly about Mendelssohn. Probably some of you here, or many of you here, know a lot about Mendelssohn. But Mendelssohn, just in very brief, was known as the Socrates of Berlin. We know that Mendelssohn was born in Dessau, came from a very poor family, was considered a great early young scholar of Jewish materials, a traditional scholar. But then he decided to go to Berlin, and he walks to Berlin. And we know where he entered Berlin because he entered through a gate that was reserved only for Jews and animals. And that already tells us something about Jewish life at this time. And when he gets to Berlin, he is an autodidact. He teaches himself all kinds of things. He teaches himself German. He teaches himself other languages. He becomes this kind of cultural phenomenon, and again is called the Socrates of Berlin. He even wins first prize in a philosophy essay contest, and the person who won second prize was Immanuel Kant, which is why I always tell people or students that the lesson from that is don't feel bad if you win second prize. You never know how history will treat you. But Mendelssohn was a phenomenon, but this got Mendelssohn into some big trouble. And the challenge really was from his Lutheran interlocutors. If Mendelssohn's so smart, why doesn't he convert to Christianity? So this is a very difficult position that Mendelssohn is in. He has to basically offer a response in public as to why he's not going to convert to Christianity. Now, it's worth saying, what were the consequences, or what would the consequences have been if Mendelssohn had insulted his Christian interlocutors? The consequences would have been collective punishment, not just for Mendelssohn and his family, but for all of the Jews in Berlin, because Jews at this time were still subject to collective punishment. So Mendelssohn's in a very tricky situation. He's in a tricky situation because he has to, on the one hand, give some kind of answer to the question of why he's not going to convert, but also not insult his interlocutors. So how does he do it? It's important to note that first he has a nervous breakdown, and this just, again, goes to the kind of pressure that he was under. But then he publishes this book, which is called Jerusalem, or On Judaism and Power. Now, this book, from, again, my own experience thinking about this material, really changed the way I thought about things, precisely because I read this book for a long time and I thought this book just doesn't make any sense. And it was very bothersome for that reason. But eventually I came to realize that the reason why there are tensions in the book, or why it doesn't kind of all make sense, is because Mendelssohn was in an impossible position. Because again, he's trying to balance not insulting Christians, but still being able to, have some rationale for being Jewish. And at the same time, he's trying to kind of square a circle. He's trying to say how Judaism can fit into this category of religion that doesn't quite fit into. And so why doesn't Judaism fit into that category? Just very briefly, the answer is because, of course, Judaism, historically understood, is not only a religion in this modern sense, as described by Schleiermacher. Instead, Judaism is a religion, it's a culture, it's a nationality, and at least in terms of peoplehood. And it's at least those three things all combined. And again, we see these debates still today. What is Judaism? And these debates really emerge, I would want to argue, with Mendelssohn's response. So just like Schleiermacher's book, where the subtitle tells us a lot about the argument of the book, in Jerusalem, the subtitle also tells us a lot about the argument about the book. So the argument of the book is basically that Judaism and power have nothing to do with one another. That Judaism is not about power, or Judaism is not about politics, and even Jewish law is not about politics, but instead Judaism is a religion. That's the argument of the book, which in a way might sound not that interesting to us today, whether or not we agree or disagree with it, but it was a radical argument in this context. So what did Mendelssohn mean by Judaism is a religion? I'm going to skip the next. Actually, let me go back to the next slide. Sorry. Okay, so let's think about religion for a minute and its relationship to, say, something that's called theology, which is usually a Christian term. And here I have on the slide Thomas Aquinas, who understands theology as including what we know of God, what God teaches, and a path towards God. Now, notice how Mendelssohn, this is a quote from Jerusalem, understands Judaism in relationship to this, okay? Judaism knows of no revealed religion in the sense in which Christians understand this term. The Israelites possess a divine legislation, laws, commandments, ordinances, rules of life, instruction in the will of God as to how they should conduct themselves in order to attain temporal and eternal felicity. So Mendelssohn is very clear, Judaism is a revealed religion, but he wants to say it's not a religion like Christians understand it. Why? Because it doesn't have anything to do, he argues, with belief. What Judaism has to do with is following the revealed law, which God has given only to the Jewish people. And this isn't about belief. Mendelssohn actually argues Judaism doesn't require you to believe in anything. Okay, and that's also a very radical claim. Nevertheless, Judaism is a religion. So already here we see his awareness of the tension between this kind of concept of religion as having to do whether it's feeling or whether it's belief, really having to do with the individual, and the tension between that and the way he's describing Judaism, which has to do with law and community. So in short, Mendelssohn makes an argument that there are three types of truths. I'll just say this very quickly, and I want to say it so that we can appreciate how actually this set the stage for other forms of what we call Jewish religion that developed in the 19th century after Mendelssohn. So there are three kinds of truths for Mendelssohn. One is eternal truth, and he calls that the truths of mathematics. And so that's something like 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's going to be true regardless of place and time. That's what he means by eternal. Contingent truth for him is something like the laws of physics. They require, contingent truths require observation. So it's in that sense that they are contingent. And then there are historical truths. What are historical truths? Historical truths are truths that relate to some event in history, an event that happens in one particular place and time. And so Mendelssohn's argument is that Judaism does not conflict with eternal or contingent truths, but Judaism is a historical truth. What does that mean? It means that Judaism is the historical truth of God's revelation at Sinai and the giving of the Torah to Moses. And this happened one time in one place. And his argument is that this is why Jews still need to follow the law. This is the basis of Judaism. But this is also why Christians or anyone else don't have to be Jewish, because the law and God's revelation at Sinai pertains only to the Jews. So this is the way that Mendelssohn tries to balance, not obviously refuting Christianity, though he's got some criticism of Christianity, right? He wants to say that Jews aren't required to believe in anything. And the unsaid thing in that context is that Christians, of course, do require dogmatic belief, which do conflict with reason. And that's a problem, say, for Mendelssohn's Enlightenment interlocutors who are very invested in reason and rationality. So Christianity, he implies, is more problematic. But Christians don't have to worry about Judaism because it's not competing with Christianity in this sense. Basically, Judaism is only for Jews, and it's a religion only for Jews. And this again, whether this argument makes sense or not is open to question. But I want to suggest that we have to understand the argument in the context of the very specific historical challenge that Mendelssohn was presented with. So then Mendelssohn, at the end of Jerusalem, describes the ceremonial law, or let's just call it Jewish law, in some very interesting terms. He says the ceremonial law itself is a kind of living script, rousing the mind and heart, full of meaning, never ceasing to inspire contemplation, and to provide the occasion and opportunity for oral instruction. So what's interesting is that Mendelssohn's using this term here, living script, and it seems to be a direct reference, I think, to 2 Corinthians 3:6, where St. Paul very famously says, the written code kills, but the spirit gives life, where at least as Paul had been interpreted by Luther in particular, the written code is understood to be Jewish law, and the spirit is understood to be faith in Jesus. So Mendelssohn kind of inverts this and says that no, the ceremonial law itself is a living script. And basically, this is what Jewish religion is. It's not faith in this dogmatic sense, like Christians have it, but instead it's this living script that is kept alive and keeps the mind and the heart alive, and it continues to inspire. It's an argument also for oral Torah, which I'm happy to say more about. I leave it to the side for here. But this is basically how Mendelssohn comes to understand or make the claim that Judaism is a religion, and that's therefore Jews can happily live in harmony as equal citizens with their German neighbors. Now, the cost of this particular perspective on religion is detaching Judaism from politics. So just a few quotes here from Mendelssohn's Jerusalem. I have said that the Mosaic constitution did not persist long in its erstwhile purity. Give to Caesar and give to God too, to each his own, since the unity of interest is now destroyed. And even today, no wiser advice than this can be given to the house of Jacob. Adapt yourselves to the morals and the constitution of the land in which you have been removed, but hold fast to the religion of your fathers too. Bear both burdens as well as you can. So we see this detachment of Judaism from politics. So on the one hand, what we see is that Mendelssohn describes Judaism as a religion, yet he recognizes the tension or the problems that come from trying to describe Judaism in this kind of holy, here I mean it with a W, apolitical sense. Now, each of the movements of modern Judaism that developed in Germany, the Reform movement, the positive historical school, what we now call conservative Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism, all actually picked up a piece of this from Mendelssohn. So Mendelssohn thought this wasn't an issue in terms of why Jews would remain Jews. And as you see on the slide, he who is not born into the law need not bind himself to the law, but he who is born into the law must live according to the law and divide according to the law. So Jews would have to follow the law no matter what, was Mendelssohn's claim. Of course, this becomes a big question once Jews are actually emancipated after Mendelssohn's death. And then the question becomes, why should Jews, at least from a kind of temporal, political, social perspective, have to follow the law? And this is where we get the development of the modern movements. So as you see on the slide, these are three features of Mendelssohn's definition of Judaism. It abides by the fact of Jewish law, Judaism's historical truth, and Judaism coheres with rational universal truths. So we can understand each of the modern denominations. I won't be able to go into them in any great detail as, again, picking up a piece of this. The abiding fact of Jewish law, that becomes definitional for what becomes modern orthodoxy. Historical truth, that becomes definitional for what became positive historical or conservative Judaism. And that Judaism coheres with rational universal truths, that's what became definitional for Reform Judaism. So we'll see here that each of the movements defines Judaism as a religion in this kind of again, and in this category, by following Mendelssohn. So, of course, Reform Judaism comes first. And here we have Abraham Geiger is not the Jewish people likewise endowed with such a genius, a religious genius. So not only is Judaism a religion for Geiger, but it is the religious genius of Western civilization. Then positive historical Judaism comes second. And there we see that positive historical Judaism affirms both the divine value and the historical basis of Judaism, and therefore believes that by introducing some changes, it may achieve some argument with the concepts and conditions of time. Finally, again, I know this is very brief, Samson Raphael Hirsch, modern orthodoxy is a movement that comes later than Reform and positive historical. And here, even though Hirsch in other places claims to deny that Judaism is a religion, he nevertheless here makes these two claims that cohere with a claim that Judaism is a religion, if religion is understood as something that is not political. Jews are, quote, those loyal to the divine law and the obligation to belong and to support the local congregation. So he defines law not in terms of Jewish law, not in terms of a political involvement, but rather individual loyalty. And he also writes, it is precisely the purely spiritual nature of Israel's nationhood that makes it possible for Jews everywhere to tie themselves fully to the various states in which they live, end quote. So again, for Hirsch too, Judaism is a religion. Happy to say more about that since this is more of a controversial claim. So we see in all three of these figures the way in which Judaism is described in these apolitical terms. So let's come to the study of modern religion and specifically the intervention of anthropology into this, okay? So I just want to mention Talal Assad, who's the author, who teaches at, or he's retired now, but at City University in New York, who's the author of an important book called Genealogies of Religion. He happens to be the son of a famous Jewish convert to Islam, Leopold Weiss, who became known as Muhammad Assad, and some of you in Berlin, you can see some plaques to Muhammad Assad. But Talal Assad writes here, I'll just quote, the suggestion that religion has a universal function is one indication of how marginal religion has become in modern industrial society as a site for producing disciplined knowledge and personal discipline. And his task is, quote, to problematize the idea of an anthropological definition of religion by assigning that endeavor to a particular history of knowledge and power, including a particular understanding of our legitimate past and future, out of which the modern world has been constructed. Okay, I'm going to try and say what this means through this next quote. He says here, if the secularization thesis seems increasingly implausible to some of us, this is not simply because religion is now playing a vibrant part of the modern world of nations. In an important sense, what many would anachronistically call religion was always involved in the world of power. If the secularization thesis no longer carries the weight it once did, this is because the categories of politics and religion turn out to implicate one another more profoundly than we thought, a discovery that has accompanied our growing understanding of the concepts of the modern nation state. The concept of the secular cannot do without the idea of religion. So what's he saying? Just to say it very briefly. What is the secularization thesis? The secularization thesis is basically a thesis by early 20th century sociologists that basically said, we're now living in a world that's completely secularized, religion's going to go away. And so the idea is that the secular overcomes religion. Now, anybody who's read a newspaper or looked around the world knows that religion didn't go away. Okay, so when Assad is writing at the end of the 20th century, it's in the context of recognizing that religion hasn't gone away. But here's his point. His point is that actually it's not that there was religion and now we have something called the secular. Instead, what he's saying is the modern concept of religion is part and parcel of this idea of the secular. In other words, religion is a modern category that has a particular history. And its particular history has actually to do everything to do with politics and the politics of the modern nation state. So this insight is something that has really is just very common now in the field of religion, and Assad and others make this in the context of the study of Islam. But what I want to point out is not only did many of our German Jewish thinkers that I already talked about were aware of this because they recognized that talking about Judaism as a religion was the price of being citizens of the modern nation state. And that's the source of some of the tensions we see in their thought. But also historians of the Jews have also recognized this long before Talal Assad recognized this in the 90s. And so I want to look at just very quickly, and then I'm almost finished. I have three thinkers that did this. Okay. So one of the thinkers is from the German Jewish context itself, Heinrich Gretz, one of the most important Jewish historians. And this is something that Gretz wrote. Judaism is not a religion of the individual, but of the community. That actually means that Judaism, in the strict sense of the word, is not even a religion if one understands thereby the relationship of man to his creator and his hopes for his earthly existence, but rather a constitution for a body politic. Now, Gretz was not a Zionist. Some have called him a proto-Zionist. But part of what he's trying, so I just want to be clear when he says body politic, part of what he's trying to point out here is the tensions between this kind of apolitical concept of religion and what Judaism actually is. And it's worth noting that Gretz was very poorly received in Germany because of this. A number of prominent anti-Semitic German historians claimed that what Gretz had wrote and his history of the Jews was an insult to Germany, and there was actually a trial connected with this. And this is just to say that this is something that you weren't supposed to say in Germany, precisely because the claim had to be that Judaism was a religion. Okay, so I want to now mention just briefly Salo Baron, who isn't really someone who was talking about religion, but his understanding of Jewish emancipation is directly related to what we've been talking about. So this is from a very famous essay called Ghetto and Emancipation. Baron writes, quote, complex, isolated, in a sense foreign, if the Jewish community was left more severely alone by the state than many other corporations. Thus, the Jewish community of pre-revolutionary days had more competence over its members than the modern federal, state, and municipal governments combined. Education, administration of justice between Jew and Jew, taxation for communal and state purposes, health, markets, public order, were all within the jurisdiction of the community corporation. Statute was reinforced by religious supernatural sanctions as well as by coercive public opinions within the group. And for example, a Jew put in cherem, excommunication, by Jewish courts was practically a lost man, and the cherem was a fairly common means of imposing the will of the community on the individual. All the self-governing apparatus disappeared, of course, when the revolution brought equal rights to European Jewry. So what is Baron saying there? Baron is saying that there's a story that Jews tell themselves, and also non-Jews tell, about how Judaism only became political in the modern era, either through the receiving of individual rights by individual Jews in nation states or by Zionism. But what Baron's pointing out is that that actually pre-modern Jewish communities had a lot of political power, okay, and more power than other communities had. And basically what he's saying is that the modern period or emancipation is the loss of communal power. So to put this in the context of Talal Asad and others about the concept of religion, the point is that this idea that Judaism is a religion, what that shows is the political weakening of the Jewish community, okay? The political weakening of the Jewish community by another political entity, and that's the modern nation state. So far from being a kind of apolitical category, this category of religion tells us something very important about modern politics. Okay, this is my last figure, and then I just have one more thing to say, and that's Leo Strauss, who put this in a different way. He said, liberalism stands or falls by the distinction between state and society, or by the recognition of the private sphere protected by the law, but impervious to the law, with the understanding that above all, religion as particular religion belongs to the private sphere. So the point here is that religion is defined by the liberal state. I mean, we all know this in a certain sense, but that the kind of creation of this category of religion is a category that serves the modern nation state. So it's again, okay, final slide, my takeaways, okay. The takeaways are that, one, religion is a category through which we can approach the politics of German Jews and German Jewish thought. That's kind of my overall claim today, is that where this category has changed in terms of the scholarship is understanding how it's about the politics. But I've also tried to suggest that some of our German Jewish thinkers were well aware of this long before anthropologists began to comment on this. And Judaism only became a religion with the advent of the modern nation state, or we can put that differently, Judaism only became a religion, became only a religion with the advent of the modern nation state. Finally, my final point is that secularism, properly understood, reflects not a response to pre-existing religion, as many proponents of the secularization thesis would have it, but rather the very invention of the modern idea of religion as belief divorced from politics. So that's basically it. And I'm happy to take questions. I will stop sharing.
Yeah.
You stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor Batnitzky, for the fascinating presentation and walking us through such a complex topic. And to our audience, there is still time to ask your questions. I will start with my questions. So first of all, how do German Jewish debates about Zionism fit into this complex picture?
Okay, thanks. So I think what's interesting is that early German Jewish debates about Zionism reflected or internalized this modern idea that religion is this apolitical category. And so what many Zionists argued was that religion, this idea of religion, is precisely what was responsible for Jews not recognizing that they were a nation. I'll give you an example from Moses Hess, a German Jew, from his book Rome and Jerusalem, where he criticizes each movement of modern Judaism, and he calls them each of our Jewish Protestants have a code of their own, and he really describes them as these apolitical um, religions. And he is someone who did recognize that this was a modern construct. And Hess's argument is that basically Judaism is not just Jews are not just a nation, but they're actually the original nation. This is an argument we find often in German Jewish thought, and sometimes in Israeli context, is that Jews did this first and were the best at it. So the argument is that actually Jews are a family. This is how he makes the claim, and a family that is related to the larger human family. And so nationalism for him is precisely the rejection of religion, and for other early Zionists as well.
And how does German Jewish social history relates to this picture?
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I didn't talk here about microhistory because it's really not what I do but I think that a lot of the microhistory does actually support the way in which this idea of Jewish religion was privatized. And a lot of the emphasis on the social history in terms of what happens in the home and the ways in which what women do in the home, I think really supports this thesis of how Judaism becomes only a religion in the German Jewish context.
And we have actually one question asked right now, but I thought we could actually treat this question in a broader context of the relationship between Jewish religion and Jewish law. So the question is pretty complex, but I will just read it. How is a Jew seen by other Jews who is born a Jew but does not follow Judaic laws? So maybe we can talk about the Jewish religion and Jewish laws in.
Okay, so right, so that's a big question, right? How are Jews who don't follow Jewish law seen by Jews who do follow Jewish law? So this is, of course, at the heart of the debates from which the three modern movements of modern Judaism emerge in the German Jewish context in the 19th century. So I think the way that Jews who observe the law see those other Jews is that they're still Jewish, but they're bad Jews, basically. And because the law is the foundational for Judaism. And that's what these debates, when we talk about the modern movements, you then have the Reform Jews saying, no, what's foundational is actually this religious idea, which is this idea of monotheism that Jews brought to the world, which goes with ethical universal values. And then you have the positive historical school agreeing with the modern Orthodox that it is about law, but they want to argue also that the law changes. But I think that the interesting question about how Jewish law and Jewish religion relate to each other in the German Jewish context, where that's really interesting, is that what we see is the way in which religious law comes to be described in only religious terms. So what I mean by that is if you look at pre-modern Judaism and you look at a figure, I'm just going to, the most famous figure of all, Moses Maimonides, and his conception of Jewish law, he understands Jewish law as having a political dimension. I mean, and so part of our problem is as late 20th century, well, I guess we're in the early 21st century people, is that we think politics only means the nation state, but politics can mean lots of other things. And of course, did mean lots of other things historically. So for someone like Maimonides, Jewish law, of course, has a political dimension because it's what brings what hold the community together. It helps individuals to form proper beliefs, to behave properly, but it does have a political function in sort of promoting a political good. But what we see in the German Jewish context, and this carries through to a lot of forms of Judaism today, not all, but a lot, is that now what used to be considered a law that was for the community and a public good is now understood in individualistic terms as something that is only religious. And that, in a lot of ways, is one of the fundamental tensions in modern Jewish thought, is how to think about a law that is only religious. This happens in Eastern Europe too, but for different reasons, where it comes to be understood in very individualistic terms and only for the individual. So one of the things I just want to point out that's fascinating about that is that this is the way in which also, at least in the American context, and I think the British context too, people talk about law in law schools. So just like religion becomes its own separable category, law becomes a separate category in and of itself. And so both law is actually treated often, I mean, again, there are debates about this, but treated in apolitical terms. In fact, that's the argument, is that the rule of law means that judges are not making decisions based on their political or moral opinions. Instead, the law is this self-constituting system. And so we see a lot of parallels, I'd say, in general, between this modern category of religion and this modern category of law.
There is one more question actually coming from my colleague, David Brown, and I will read it. It's a little bit longer. Your recap of the bind that Mendelssohn was in and controversies like Mendelssohn Lavater or Friedlander Schleiermacher made me think of Leo Baeck and Adolf von Harnack in the early 20th century. Is it right to think of this as sort of parallels to one another? And what changed over the 19th century?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I definitely think that Beck and Harnack is another, that would have been a good lecture, right, to do those three pairs together. Um, I think on the one hand, not a lot changed, but on the other hand, something did change. I think that what didn't change was, once again, this use of this category of religion and the insistence not just that Judaism was a religion, but that Judaism was the best religion. We see that implicitly in Mendelssohn. That's his claim about the ceremonial law. It does something that dogma certainly can't do. And so I think it's certainly in Beck's uh, response to Harnack, we see a similar claim. But I think we see something really different with Beck, and that is the way in which Beck at various points is far more confident than either Mendelssohn and certainly Friedlander were, in that Beck really thought Jews should start missionizing and bringing other people into the Jewish fold. And I think that's extremely interesting that he had I would say the confidence to be able to claim that, and also was willing in a way that his predecessors were not to say that Judaism can and should be a kind of, I'll use this word, he wouldn't have used this word, kind of a competitor on the world stage.
We still have 5 minutes, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, this conversion controversies in Israel and India. This is a topic that is also present in the German Jewish history, and I'm sure it's very interesting to many people from the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this. This has to do with again this definition of religion. So one way to think about religion would be to think about conversion as the epitome of religion. If you think religion is about the individual and you think the conversion that religion is about belief or something like that, then conversion epitomizes religion. And so I think what's interesting in both the Israeli and the Indian cases is that the dominant so-called religions there, Judaism and Hinduism respectively, don't view uh, Judaism or Hinduism in this way, and also then have this deep ambivalence about conversion in both places. And they have a deep ambivalence about conversion in both places because the claim in both, they're very different from one another, but the claim in both cases is that to be a Jew is the whole of life. It's also cultural, it's historical, it's familial, very similar to Hindu arguments. And there's actually a parallel story to be told about how Hinduism became a religion in the modern period through British colonialism. So my interest in this project is really seeing how the different states navigate this question of conversion, which in different periods does actually go into so-called secular courts, how to deal with it. So in the Israeli case, I'm interested in the controversies about conversion into Judaism. In the Indian case, I'm interested in controversies about conversion to Hinduism. So I could say a lot more about that individually, but I would go on for a while. I'll just say that there's a lot of reason to make this comparison from a historical perspective. One, just because of this issue of the development of both Jewish nationalism and Hindu nationalism as being responses to what each side sees as the wrong claim that Judaism or Hinduism is a religion. And secondly, obviously, in terms of the kind of historical parallels between Israel and India, both in terms of partition and also the ways in which personal law systems were kept in place after the British, and of course, in the case of Israel, also the Ottomans, but after they left. And so there's a lot of really interesting parallels. So overall, I suppose what the comparison is about is also seeing religion as this political concept, as how it's related to national identity. And my own view is that this is the case even in a place like the United States, where we always seem to be claiming religion is not about national identity. But I do think that in American courts, for instance, in child custody cases, when it comes to family law, we actually see some of the same dynamics.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the book personally. And to everybody, thank you very much for attending our event. Professor Batnitzky, thank you very much for speaking today. And we will continue with the series after the summer. On September 10th, Tobias Brinkman will talk about migration. Thank you very much and join us again in September. Thank you.